what are next level steps to take? So you have your, let's see, you have your setup, you have basically what you've described so far. You have what you need. You have your deal stages, you have your pipeline, you've connected your sources, you have consent, and you have maybe a few members of staff on your sales team, right? You grow, suddenly you're 200 people. What happens then with the CRM as a company matures? What sort of things do you need to keep in mind?
It depends a bit on the specific evolution of the company. But if we take it, let's say, a holistic startup point of view, in the beginning, it's all about getting leads. Then it's all about creating the customers from those leads. And then as you mature, you actually have to keep them as customers. So one of the next steps in that evolution would be, okay, we need to think about renewals. We need to think more about forecasting. We need to think about, in general, reporting. How is our efforts actually bearing fruit? Where in the beginning, it's very much like day-to-day action. You're kind of in the weeds, but you get more and more distance from it as the company grows. So it's about keeping track of all the things that are important. So you can even set up automations like, okay, now there's 2 months until this contract needs renewal. We need the sales people or the CS people to start reaching out to this. It could be the whole CS department, just customer service, get them involved and sort of create a portal for them as well. But it's also a thing about keeping it clean, I would say. Again, with too many chefs, sometimes you need a pretty strict approach to what is created and how it's handled. One sales guy, if you take the whole approach from that, you can say this is going fine, we're just using their approach to sales. Suddenly there are two, they're working differently. Okay, we need to have a somewhat uniform process. So it becomes much more about creating processes and make sure people follow it. We often joke about one of the hardest things about having a clear CRM is it usually requires some form of manual input. And if they don't do that, then stuff just breaks. A good example is from a marketing point of view. If we want to track let's say a deal, and we want to say what sourced that deal. From a very easygoing perspective, we're going to say what is the original source, first touch, it's important here. Then we'll say whatever was the first contact from this company that led to this deal. But it's often the first lead coming in is not actually the person attached to the deal. So you need to connect those two data points. And if the salespeople do not do any form of connection here, then it becomes a problem.
So when we're talking user roles and permissions, and then tying that back to manual input, how do you manage that?
Well, it's a challenge from time to time, yeah.
What would you suggest, like companies? One thing is user roles and permissions. Obviously, a lot of people can do a lot of things if they have all the permissions.
Yeah.
So I know that they gate it into like segments. So you have marketing permissions or roles, and you have sales roles and permissions, and then someone like you would be the admin with the full overview, right?
Yeah.
Is that typically how things would play out?
It would be if you're big enough. The smaller teams, everyone has access to everything, and that's okay. But as you grow, you need to limit the permissions a lot, depending on what the ownership of each team is, because some of the permissions are kind of required even though you're not doing it to do the specific thing you want to do, which can be annoying. But you can create teams in HubSpot and have certain permissions to each member of that team. I would also talk a bit about sort of let's call it sales and marketing alignment. Make sure that you have clear processes and knows who owns what part of the whole funnel, and make sure that everyone on each team is on board on how you do stuff. Yeah. Because permissions will only get you so far. Yeah. You also need to have a clear vision, yeah. A clear strategy for what that team is doing and how that fits into the whole company strategy.
Yeah. What about if we go back to sales and manual input? Do you crack the whip or what do you do? Because we both know that these CRMs can oftentimes end up becoming a rabbit hole. It's overcomplicated, when in actuality it could be simple, but then a company grows, multiple stakeholders comes in. Difficult. So first thing, how do we manage the manual input and actually getting the data in? What are your suggestions?
I'm much more like a carrot and a stick kind of guy. So I would rather incentivize good behavior than punish bad behavior. But that's just my personal point of view. It very much depends on the company structure. One of the big asks I always have when we talk about attribution, for instance, is why do we need attribution? Because in a lot of cases, you need some form of attribution because sales get commission. But that's also an incentive to act in a certain way. So you need to make sure that action matches what you want it to be done. So for instance, let's say if a sales guy get, 10% commission on each deal he closes, that's sourced by sales. Well, then he's incentivized to sort of say, well, all the deals I closed was sourced by sales. So you kind of need to have this clear incentive for each person to handle it. Yeah. Whereas usually marketing, for instance, they don't get commission or anything. So they only need the attribution to sort of explain why you should keep spending money on marketing, which is also a cost and a thing, but it's not as important as it would be if your salary depended on it. So it's a lot about figuring out what are the incentives in the company, why do we need this specific thing, and then try to match the outcome and the action with the incentive to make sure that people are incentivized to do the right thing. A good example is we had a client at one point where the salespeople got commission on just what they closed, like a minor thing, but they were just incentivized to close as much as possible. So they quickly figured out, well, the easiest thing to do is just upsell. So they spent all their time upselling. So there was no new business because it was way easier to close upselling. So they spent all the time upselling. A new lead came in and it was like, nah, I'm just going to upsell to this person. So you kind of need to have your incentives in order to make it work.
Yeah. I like your mindset of thinking about why, because I think about what you said when a business matures and how they then work with their CRM. So you said something about basically mapping pain points. And my mind goes straight to reporting and segmentation in terms of, where is the fastest deal cycle, in what vertical, what people are part of the buying committee and everything. And those things can in fact be mapped if you have the properties to collect it. And then we go back to the pain point of, manual data inputs, right?
Yep.
Obviously it can be enriched, but sometimes you want the manual inputs of sales depending on, how did the conversation go where you just logged a call. And I think in essence, it's a lot of this, like the inability to actually draft the reports because of a lack of manual inputs happen because sales do not properly understand why should we? It's time you take away from us closing deals or progressing deals, right? So every time I log this manual data, it's admin work, right? I don't have time for that. But then when you think about it, if you do aggregate all this data, you then get a report saying how you could work more efficiently to close more deals. So you're setting yourself up for success. But I don't believe that's properly communicated. And I think if it was, then maybe more salespeople would do it. Maybe not. We're just marketing folks in here, right? So at the end of the day, take it with a grain of salt. But I do think the why is so important. Why should we do it? What is the end goal? I really like that mentality.
It's also about how to answer the problem the best way. Because sometimes when you got a boss to say, I want this, then if you just do what you perceive as what they want, it might not be the best solution. If you ask why and understand the why, then your solution might be way different. But you gave them what they wanted, which was not what they initially asked about. And I find that often that's where the magic happens, because when you can solve for the why instead of the ask specifically, then you can sort of broaden the whole horizon. And sometimes you can add stuff they didn't even think about. Sometimes you find some hindrance on the way that they didn't even think about because they thought it was easy, but it was not. You need, again, a lot of input on data before you can figure it out. So the why is very important.
Absolutely. I'm curious about something specifically. So one of the things I asked Frederick, I think in the first episode of this podcast, was like, if he was a head of marketing, what would he do in the first 90 days? And now we've sort of mapped both some of the positives and the potential negative occurrences that can happen when it comes to HubSpot or any CRM. I'm curious as to your point. Let's say that you've been hired at a company, or maybe from here, right? And you need to set up their HubSpot. From the ground up, they have nothing. Could you perhaps walk us through how you would do that? From like step one to, obviously there's hundreds of steps, I realize. But in broad terms, what are the most quintessential aspects of setting up that CRM, where you could sort of give the category of actions and then sort of mapping that to a point where you're like, I have my MVP. What would that look like for Johannes?
Well, it would depend on how much of the organization is going to live in HubSpot, whether it's just marketing, it's marketing, sales, or etc. But if we just boil it down to the quintessential parts, then first of all, I would make sure that HubSpot is technically set up correct, which would mean we need to connect it to the DNS, we need to connect it to the website so you can track here, we need to connect it to all the forms. Then from there on out, I would sort of map out the use case in the company, where you sort of figure out again what happens to lead, when should they go from one team to another, when are they closed won, to sort of get that whole thing in order. And if it's completely from scratch, probably also look into something like very basic, but thank you email or whatever we heard from you in the demo forum. And then you would want to set up a funnel, a deal funnel, actually disregarding if sales are in HubSpot or not, because if they're not, you want to connect it to wherever they are, so you also have that information in HubSpot. That's very important for marketing, to have a revenue overview. And then start figuring out if there's any automations that make sense. You talked about offline sources at one point. We always like to create some sort of source framework where we try to decipher where are the sources actually coming from in the offline sources, and that's very company dependent. It could be a sales guy uploading everything, it could be this integration we have, but trying to map that out, because it can be a major pain when you in a year or two have to look at all the contacts you have, and half of them is from your product, just created it, and you're not really sure how or why. So that would be one of my go-tos. Like from a starting point of view, there's actually those are the ones that I find most important, and the rest can sort of come later. It very much depends on the maturity of the organization, and even though like data hygiene is very important, I'm also a big favor of I'd rather do stuff than not. Yeah. So rather just get rolling and just reiterate on it than sit back and wait for the perfect setup. Because usually the perfect setup is never perfect for more than a short while anyway. So what is perfect today might not be perfect tomorrow as your company evolves, as you evolve. So I'd much rather have something built at 80% and then just improve it as we go, rather than just set everything up completely running. And from a let's get out of the garage, let's get started, I would say technical setup, connect with website, get your forms in order, get an overview of the funnel, and then the rest you can sort of build from there. Again, depending on how mature your setup is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my input there would be to have the salespeople utilize properties like you mentioned, pain point, industry, these things, map the buying committee as soon as possible, so you have that data. Because it surprises me how many companies get investments, even if they can't actually say truthfully where the money is coming from, in terms of which industries, what sub-industries within that industry, what job titles are part of the buying committee. Like, at least that's my experience, right? But these are large companies, and then you're thinking, gosh. And if you do a revenue analysis of how things actually are, again, even if they haven't done it properly, you can still get 80% of the way there. I think Divya could at least.
Yeah, but it also depends very much on the maturity of the company.
Depends on the maturity.
Because to be honest, if I was to set up a HubSpot from scratch in a mature company, I would have to do a lot of mapping beforehand. Yeah. Like, what data do we have? Where do we put it in? Where do people do their processes? Which Excel sheets do I need to take into consideration? How can I move data from the random Google Docs that lies around in different sales departments into the CRM? So it very much depends on the maturity and where they are. Yeah. And here by maturity, I don't necessarily mean how complicated they are, and just be how big they are. They might not have any good processes or anything. It's just a matter of size, because the bigger they are, the more random data is all around, and you kind of need to see, first of all, can we clear something up? We often see that duplicates is annoying. How can we clean that up, and what is actually important? I always like to say that when people are migrating to HubSpot from somewhere, try to figure out why. Because usually we like to say, well, HubSpot is way better than a lot of the other ones, based purely on the UI. It's easier to approach, at least for a lot of us. But if you have issues with your current CRM, figure out what they are, because migrating might not solve it. It might just replicate the issues. If a lot of the issues is data hygiene, well, then you shouldn't just migrate all the data. You need to sort of clean it up before you migrate. If you want that fresh start, you need to figure out what data are we actually bringing with us and what should we leave behind. So definitely also do a lot of mapping and figure out what are the processes now and where can we optimize.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because there's so many different avenues to start from. And it's also interesting in the sense that obviously you see it from an operations perspective, right, and structure. And I see it as, okay, we need to have these data points because then we can maybe go out, target even better companies that will move through the deal stages faster. And I think that's also where you need multiple people in the room to discuss, right?
Yeah.
But there should be one clear person who is directing, and that should be someone like you. Full overview, you know exactly like what needs to be done at what stages. And I think sometimes if a company, like you said in the beginning, if they try to hire an agency like us, and they don't have an internal person, and then, you know, you can do your job perfectly, right? You can set everything up, but the company matures, and then suddenly that very perfect setup that you created no longer is, because that's how things are, right?
Yeah, it's outdated, or they removed some property and they forgot about it, and that was very important to some of the flows. Usually it's also, when we get brought in like this, it's an issue about the fact that no one is owning anything. So you just get in to see all this data lying there and no one knows where it came from, why it is as it is, or what they would like to do. Because I also see CRMs as a tool. After all, it's just a tool. So it needs to serve the purpose. So we need to figure out, why do you want it? What do you need it for? And that can be very hard, especially if there's no sales and marketing aligned. I know we talk about sales and marketing a lot, but that's kind of our area. So if there's no alignment here, it's just like, what do you want to happen, right? And that's important. Again, back to the why. Why are we doing this? Why did you do this beforehand? Because sometimes the legacy data is good. We just need to understand, where did it come from? Why is it as it is?
Yeah, I think that's almost the biggest takeaway, because I wanted to ask you about pitfalls. And I think one of the first pitfalls, at least at the end, listening to you explain it here, is not starting with the why. And I think the second pitfall, from my view, is not having an internal stakeholder to either cooperate or help if you hire an agency, and or manage afterwards.
At least someone who owns it.
Someone who owns it, yeah.
That's important. And it might not be a super user or anything, just it's your responsibility to carry this forward. Because a lot of stuff is said and done, but with everything automation, it can break if new stuff is introduced and it's not kept up to date.
Would you have more pitfalls? I mentioned two. Do you have anything that comes to mind?
I would say keep it simple, because in the end, it's easy to make data convoluted or complicated. It's way harder to keep it simple. So again, laser focus on why. What do we need and why? Even just a field about pain points, try to see if you can limit it to certain types instead of just free text and people just write all the random stuff like, oh, I'm really annoyed by my grandmother. Like, that's not going to work anything in the CRM, right? So you need to have some sort of a direction. So again, make it simple and start with the why. That's kind of what I would go for.
I feel like that's the perfect way to end this episode. Johannes, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.
Anytime.
And you're definitely going to be brought on again another time, that's for sure.
Thank you.